When you think Mughal Empire, what comes to mind? Probably grand emperors, right? Sprawling palaces, massive battles. But what if I told you the real story, the source of all that power and all that wealth, is actually hiding somewhere, well, a lot smaller? Okay, let's get into it. Because if you really want to understand the empire, you've got to start with its foundation. And that foundation, it's the village.
Think about this for a second. During the 16th and 17th centuries, a mind-blowing 85% of India's entire population lived in villages. I mean, that's not just part of the empire. For the vast majority of people, the village was their entire world. It was the absolute, undisputed, beating heart of Mughal India.
Yeah, and this vibrant, bustling village life, this, right here, this was the real engine of the empire. I mean, every single piece of gold stashed in the treasury, every soldier marching in the army, it was all paid for by the surplus, the extra food and goods, produced in scenes just like this. It all came from the land.
So, you see, this creates a really crucial relationship. The state's entire income, it came directly from what was grown on the land. And that set up this really complex dance in every single village. It was this constant back and forth, this web of cooperation, but also a ton of conflict. They needed each other, but they were also constantly at odds.
All right, so let's zoom in a bit. Let's talk about the main characters in this whole story. Who were the actual people working the land? The ones powering this absolutely massive imperial machine. Okay, so if you were to look at the official documents from back then, you'd see one word pop up over and over and over again: riot. Now that was the common Indo-Persian term for a peasant, kind of the catch-all word. But, and this is important, hidden inside that one little word was a whole universe of different kinds of people.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Broadly speaking, you had two types of peasants. On one side, you've got the khud kashta. These are the locals, they owned and farmed land right there in their own village. But then, you had the payi kashta. These folks were non-residents. They would actually travel to farmland somewhere else on a contract. So why would you do that? Well, maybe the village next door offered better tax rates. Or on the flip side, maybe you were forced to leave your home because of a famine or just hard times. It paints a picture of a society that was way more mobile, way more fluid than we usually give it credit for.
And check this out. This quote just nails that point perfectly. It's from Babur, the very first Mughal emperor, and he was just blown away by how mobile everyone was. He literally wrote in his memoirs, the Baburnama, that villages in India could be depopulated and set up in a moment. I mean, that just completely shatters that old, tired idea of the unchanging Indian village, right? Okay, so we've got these peasants who are strategic, they're mobile, but how were they actually working the land? What did that look like day to day? Well, you might be surprised to hear that the technology they were using and the crops they were growing were incredibly sophisticated.
And here's Babur again, totally fascinated by the local tech. He's describing what we now call a Persian wheel. Listen to this. He talks about how they make two circles of rope, fix strips of wood between them, and on these fasten pitchers. It's this incredible system of wheels and pots, all turned by an animal, to pull water up from a well. I mean, this was serious engineering for the time.
And this painting, wow, it just brings his words to life, doesn't it? You can see the whole setup, the guys working the machine. And then look, those water channels snaking their way out into the fields. This kind of tech was absolutely essential if you wanted to grow crops that were thirstier than what the seasonal rains could handle.
Right, and all that water wasn't just for growing your basic wheat and rice for dinner. The Mughal state was smart. They actively encouraged farmers to grow what they called jinsi-e-kamil, which translates to perfect crops. And what were those? High-value cash crops. Think cotton, think sugarcane. Why? Simple. More valuable crops meant more tax revenue for the empire. This wasn't just subsistence farming, this was big business.
And get this, the menu was changing too. The agricultural world was becoming global. During the 17th century, all of these things you see here, maize, tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, even pineapple, arrived in India all the way from the Americas. It is absolutely wild to think that things we consider so fundamental to Indian food today, like tomatoes and chilies, were totally new and exotic back then.
So, what's the result of all this? You've got new tech, new crops, a focus on cash crops. Well, you get a population boom, a huge one. Between 1600 and 1800, estimates suggest the population of India grew by 50 million people. That's a 33% jump in just 200 years, all fueled by the incredible productivity of the land.
Okay, so let's recap. We have this productive, commercial, booming society. But how did it all hold together? Who was in charge? Who kept the peace and made the rules at the local level? Well, this is where we get to dive into the really fascinating world of how the village governed itself.
Basically, village life was organized around three main pillars. First, you had the cultivators, the farmers themselves. Then you had the village headman, who was called the muqaddam or sometimes the mandal. And finally, you had the village council, also known as the panchayat.
And a picture like this really gives us a sense of that world. You can see the village elders all gathered together. That's probably the headman there leading the meeting. And maybe those guys off to the side are officials from the state, there to talk about taxes. The big question, though, is who really holds the power in a meeting like this? It's almost never as simple as it looks.
And make no mistake, the panchayat wasn't just some casual debating club. This council had real power. I'm talking managing the village's money, funding huge community projects like digging canals that one farmer could never afford. They also upheld caste boundaries, which was a huge deal, and they could levy fines, they could even kick people out of the village. This was the true center of local power.
But wait, it gets even more complex. On top of the main village panchayat, each individual caste, or jati, had its own separate panchayats. These guys would handle all the internal stuff for their community. Disputes about land, arguments about marriage, you name it. And here's the kicker. For the most part, the Mughal state actually respected their decisions. Power wasn't just top-down from the emperor, it was incredibly decentralized.
Okay, so let's start to pull all these different threads together. We've established that you've got this powerful, largely self-governing village community. So the big question is, how did that world interact and negotiate with the massive, powerful Mughal state that was, at the end of the day, in charge?
Because here's the thing, the village wasn't some isolated little bubble. Not at all. It was a dynamic space, almost like a stage, where there was this constant negotiation going on. You had the peasants just trying to make a living, you had their local leaders, and then you had the agents of the Mughal state showing up to demand their slice of the pie.
And this system was all about push and pull. It was a total balancing act. You had peasants petitioning their local panchayat to fight back against taxes they thought were unfair. At the same time, the state wasn't just taking. It was also sometimes funding things like irrigation. You had crooked headmen skimming off the top, for sure. But you also had amazing examples of the community pulling together to fund projects that benefited everyone. It was a messy, complicated, but very real system of checks and balances.
So at the end of the day, this is what's so important to understand. For the average peasant, the village panchayat was their court. It was their place to go for an appeal. It's where they truly believed they could get a fair shake, where they could find some form of justice and, maybe most importantly, where they could hold the state accountable and demand it live up to its moral obligations.
And that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Picture this. A single peasant stands up in the village council to file a complaint against a powerful state tax collector. In that one moment, who's really more powerful? Is it the emperor sitting on his throne hundreds of miles away? Or is it the collective power of that community, right there, in that village? Something to think about.